if you got on Joe's podcast and you were to kind of give him some insight, what would you correct in the way that he eats to maybe protect him from some long-term problems he's not seeing?
I mean, I would just want to firstly make it clear that short-term outcomes and how you feel in the short or immediate term do not always reflect long-term health outcomes. And that's why we need science. I think there's clearly a lot of people that are getting benefit from adopting a ketogenic diet or a carnivore diet. And we have to remember that the vast majority of adults in a country like USA are not metabolically healthy. 70% of the calories are coming from ultra-processed foods. There's all sorts of GI issues, food sensitivities. And so it's well described in the literature when you move towards an elimination style diet, right, where you're eating a lot less foods, and particularly certain plant foods that can cause food sensitivities in people who have poor gut health, for example. It's well described that you can have an alleviation of symptoms in the short term. So I would say to Joe, what are we optimizing for? If we're just optimizing for immediate, acute, short-term symptom reduction, then I can understand why people gravitate towards a diet like that. I'm certainly not of the position that these people are lying.
Right.
I think a number of people have found better health in the short term. What I would want to speak to Joe about is how we use the body of evidence that we have to determine the risk associated with a particular dietary pattern over the long term when it comes to these various chronic diseases. And so I would like to see a number of these people bring more diversity back into their diet and find good health gradually. And it's a systematic process, right? Identifying what foods maybe they're not tolerating that well. And often you need to do this, very slowly or work with a dietitian, but shifting back to a dietary pattern that is high in fiber, is rich in unsaturated fats, has a bias towards plant protein, because the body of evidence it's overwhelmingly clear that way of eating is conducive to less disease in the long term, to better brain health, to better heart health. So it comes back to what are we optimizing for, Doug? I think a number of people that are gravitating towards those diets are, they're suffering. They're suffering, right? Metabolic health is really poor in the US. There are a lot of food sensitivities, autoimmune conditions. And so I think a lot of those people are just optimizing, for the short-term symptom reduction. And so we actually need to, I think we need to study those populations more and find tools and sort of protocols to help those people not only get symptom reduction, but after they get symptom reduction, find a dietary pattern that is going to be shifting these important biomarkers like ApoB, like blood pressure, various inflammatory markers in the right direction, so that we're not just optimizing for their health over the next few years, but we're optimizing for their health in 20, 30 years down the track.
And some of these people have access to some of the smartest people in the world. If they wanted to talk to some of the smartest people in the field of diet, nutrition, longevity, they could, and maybe they do. Why do you think, despite that, they continue to follow these diets that you believe are going to lead to long-term negative health outcomes if they, can see, if they can have the information in front of them that supports the opposite?
I mean, there are a number of biases that are no doubt at play. A lot of the foods that are being consumed within those dietary patterns are very normalized within our culture. Mm-hmm. They're popular, they're celebrated. They can be symbolic of status or have been historically, and they taste great. Putting a lot of butter over meat, there's no denying that is a tasty experience. And so I think
clip that, Simon. I'm joking. I'm joking.
There's no denying that. So I think we have to be honest with ourselves, because what can happen, and this can be on any topic in life, if we have a bias towards something, we're much more likely to just accept it because it confirms our bias without actually double clicking and investigating it. And so what I definitely think there's a large percentage of the population that want to hear eat more red meat, eat more butter, eat more cream. These things are, despite what you've been told, despite the dietary guidelines, Doug, these things are actually healthy for you. And that confirms a bias. And so I don't think a lot of people are motivated to kind of double click on that. They, very, very quickly, you'll see people just sharing that information on social media.
Right.
And before you know it, it kind of gets it a little bit out of hand.
Where do you see the healthy limit for red meat per week now with the latest research on that and longevity?
So it depends on what outcome we're thinking about, cardiovascular or cancer. But and this trips people up a lot, because one of the really difficult things in nutrition science is, if we're trying to study a particular food and how it affects the risk of a disease, you need to be really considering some very important context, and this can be lost. And one of those important pieces of context is, what are people eating instead, right? And the second is, if you're looking at a food like red meat and seeing if it associates with, say, increased risk of cancer, you're often comparing sort of low red meat to high red meat intake.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and those are relative terms. So you might have a population like various Asian populations that don't eat anywhere near the red meat of a country like America, and low and high are actually quite close together, and even the high group is not a high red meat consumption relative to America. And so you don't have a lot of contrast, what's called contrast, between low and high red meat consumption in those countries. And in a lot of those Asian studies, you don't see an association between red meat intake, comparing high and low, with outcomes like cardiovascular disease or cancer. And so people often point to that literature and say, look, this is inconsistent with literature in other parts of the world. So the research is all over the place. But it's actually, even though it appears to be contradictory, it's actually explainable. If you get into the US cohorts and you look at high versus low, now we're looking at low intakes, down at that 30 grams a day, and high intakes way north of 100 grams a day. So you have a lot more contrast between low and high, and you do see a signal. And so I don't have a perfect number of grams for you, Doug, but I think the World Research Cancer Fund recommendations sit around 450 to 500 grams of red meat per week, and above that, potentially an increase in risk of colorectal cancer.
And so that's about what, roughly a pound or so a week?
Yeah, roughly a pound.
Yeah. And I just wanted to bring that up because I think that we've had, over our friendship and our professional relationship, we've done a number of podcasts together. I don't want people to necessarily be afraid of certain foods. And you and I have talked about the dangers with that. But I also would like to inform my audience of like what the science actually says, because, I think there's this shift that happens as you get older. I think, everybody hits that point where they're like, you know what, like, I still want to look good, but I also want to make sure I'm going to be able to like see my 80s, right? Or see my 70s and be able to thrive during that time. And so I just want people to be able to understand, like, okay, you can eat some red meat throughout the week, but if you overeat it long enough, it'll lead to some pretty negative like health outcomes long term.
Right. And I'm certainly on the ssame page as you in terms of, I don't want people to think certain foods are poison. So you'll find everything online today. You'll see people screaming that dairy is poison, and then you'll find someone that's saying seed oils are poison, and then you'll find someone that's saying any dose of red meat is poison. And I recently had a debate with a carnivore doctor, and he was expressing his frustration with people fearing food, but at the same time, in that conversation, he said dairy was poison and sugar is toxic. So, And this comes back to context, Doug. And there's an enormous amount of context that is overlooked in nutrition science, and you don't see it when you read articles like on Daily Mail. They just wrote a couple of articles on seed oils, completely overlooked the important context of these studies. And so I feel really, really empathetic towards the average person who's just trying to make sense of this and is being exposed to these headlines. It becomes really difficult to know who to trust and what to eat.
Yeah, I had Dr. Robert Lustig on. I don't know if it was earlier this year or last year. Time has flown. I can't really remember, but I remember him talking about sugar, and I got him to explain what he actually meant with what he means by sugar. And he was like, I'm talking about ultra processed sugar. And I think sometimes that gets lost where people will throw things like dairy and sugar and even like vegan food under the bus. But what people are trying to mean, what I think what people actually mean is it's like these packaged foods, these highly processed foods that have tons of added sugar, etc. I mean, do you think that's what people mean when they talk about dairy being bad, sugar being bad, or do you believe they think anything with any amount of dairy or sugar is poisonous?
It depends on the person and the claim, so it's a little difficult to answer that. But certainly, I think there is a lot of conflating ultra processed foods with single ingredients. And what I mean by that is there's demonization of seed oils. And it's true that seed oils are often found in these ultra processed foods. But the effect that those ultra processed foods have on your physiology and health outcomes could be, and science has to show this, and there's so many lines of evidence that we can speak to that I believe do show this. It could be that the seed oils are not inherently problematic themselves.
Mm-hmm.
It's that when you're consuming this ultra processed food that is, yes, it contains seed oils, but it contains uh, a lot of this refined flour, added sugars, artificial ingredients. It's low in fiber, it's low in protein, it's low in water, it's hyperpalatable, it's energy dense. There are all of these properties of that food matrix. You can't just pull out one ingredient and say it's the seed oils. And that's the mistake actually this week, where there was a trial. I don't know if you saw it,
Mm-hmm.
looking at men with prostate cancer. And this is a really good study, a randomized controlled trial. How the media ran away with this and the headlines I completely disagree with, but the actual researchers conducting this research should be applauded. It's a great study. They were looking at, if you take men with prostate cancer and you randomize them to two diets, one is just a standard diet where there are a lot of these ultra processed fried foods and baked goods. And then the other diet is a diet where they tell them, they say, Doug, we want you to really reduce your consumption of baked goods, cookies, fried foods. And we also want you to increase your consumption of omega-3 rich fish, and we're going to give you an omega-3 supplement. Over the 12-month period, they were measuring sort of cancer cell proliferation growth, and there was an index they used. We won't go into the details too much, but the group consuming this less processed, diet free of fried foods and more fatty fish and omega-3s, how do you think they went? They saw less cancer cell proliferation. And the media took that study and was like, it's seed oils. Seed oils cause prostate cancer. And it's like, they weren't even told to reduce seed oils. They reduced fried foods, baked goods, cookies. All of those foods that I just mentioned have all of those other properties. Plus, they added fish oil and consuming fish. It's impossible from that study design to conclude that seed oils increased the proliferation of cancer cells. Yet that's the headlines that were published by media like Daily Mail, and all of a sudden, and I saw it everywhere, Instagram, Twitter, people just shared that without reading it, and they shared it with their own kind of tweet or caption, supporting this message that seed oils are toxic. But that's not what the study showed. But it was confirming a bias, and then social media kind of just runs with it.